The horrifying story begins when Simon decides to venture into the forest at night with his son to gather supplies. However, something happens that causes him to become separated from his son in the middle of the forest. He then has to face the most brutal and savage events imaginable. Before we dive into our scary story, we would like to ask everyone to like and subscribe to support us in continuing to bring you more terrifying tales in the future. The entire story takes us back about 50 years. Back then, if someone finished their education, they often had the opportunity to work in the city and secure a good job, unlike those who didn't go to school. The latter group lacked good job prospects and had to continue living off the land in rural areas. Simon was one of those who didn't have the chance to study. He made his living by foraging in the forest, whether it was hunting small and large animals, gathering mushrooms, bamboo shoots, wild vegetables, or forest fruits to sell and earn a living. Back then, many people had this occupation, and those who did were called hunters. At that time, Simon's village had about 7 to 8 hunters who would group together to venture into the forest to hunt and gather. When the incident occurred, it was just as these hunters were returning from the forest. Simon, seeing that his household supplies were running low, decided to go into the forest with his son to gather more supplies. On the day Simon and his son set out, Simon felt that the atmosphere was perfect for foraging. He believed that he would find plenty of good forest products that day. To reach the forest, they had to take a ferry across the river. Simon arranged for the boat to drop them off in the late afternoon and to pick them up in the evening of the next day. He planned to start collecting mushrooms at night and continue gathering supplies the next morning until the boat arrived to take them back. Upon reaching the other side of the forest by ferry, Simon and his son began their journey following their familiar path. Both were quite adept at navigating the parts of the forest they had previously explored. When they reached a certain point, they marked the spot where they would later rest and place their provisions there. Then, Simon and his son split up to gather forest products, as staying together might cause them to miss out on spotting wild animals. Simon went in one direction while his son went in another. As he walked, Simon scanned the surroundings but saw no signs of wildlife, which was unusual since there were usually birds or small animals to be seen. The animal sounds he heard seemed to be getting farther away from where he was. After walking for a while, Simon heard something moving ahead. He stealthily approached the sound and saw a peacock with a beautiful, vibrant plumage. Desiring to hunt the peacock, he decided to follow it quietly. Simon felt very lucky to have encountered a peacock that day. However, as he stalked the bird, he noticed a patch of mushrooms growing abundantly, turning the ground white. He changed his focus, deciding that he didn't need to hunt anymore. If he gathered all the mushrooms and some rattan from another area, he could return home immediately after. Simon started collecting the mushrooms, losing track of time in his task. By the time he realized it, dawn had broken. He had completely forgotten that he was in the forest with his son. Looking back, he found that he had wandered quite far, and the area around him looked unfamiliar. Simon called out for his son and heard a distant reply. Relieved, he finished gathering the mushrooms and headed back to their meeting point. On the way back, he noticed something strange. There were now many wild animals in sight, which could have been hunted. But Simon decided not to hunt them, as he already had plenty of mushrooms and his goal was to gather supplies for home. When Simon arrived at the meeting point, he did not see his son there. He tried to follow his son's tracks while calling out for him. He heard a faint reply as if his son was far away. Simon followed the sound, calling out and receiving responses, but the distance between him and his son's voice never seemed to decrease. Simon spent nearly half a day following his son's tracks, which led him to a stream in the forest. There, the tracks disappeared, making him anxious. He hesitated, unsure whether to go back or cross the stream. After pondering for a while, Simon decided to cross the stream to see if his son's tracks continued on the other side. However, there were no signs of his son. Simon continued searching for his son in that area. Time passed until it was around 3 p.m. By then, when Simon called out for his son didn't respond as he had earlier. Simon walked along the stream and began to notice that it wasn't the same stream he had been to before. Coupled with the atmosphere at that time, which was approaching dusk, he started to feel even more uneasy about not finding his son, especially since his son had never been in the forest alone before and had always accompanied him on previous trips. As the sky grew darker, Simon realized that he had become lost in the forest himself, having been preoccupied with searching for his son and forgetting the way back. He sat by the stream and thought that he would have to stay there for the night, determined to find his son before leaving the forest. That night passed until the morning of the next day, and as the sunlight appeared, Simon began searching for his son again. Despite his efforts, he couldn't find him. By the third day, he started to lose hope of finding his son and also couldn't find a way out of the forest. While wandering aimlessly, Simon suddenly heard a sound similar to wild elephants running toward him. He quickly found a place to hide, and after a while, the sound of the wild elephants faded away. Once he was sure it was safe, he emerged from his hiding place, and suddenly, he heard his son's voice calling from a corner of the forest. When Simon turned around, he saw his son. They ran to each other and embraced with joy. Simon asked his son where he had been and how he got lost, but his son didn't say much, only mentioning that he had chased after an animal and got lost. His son appeared scared the entire time, so Simon decided not to press him for more details, assuming he had encountered something traumatic. The only thing left for them to do was find a way out of the forest and return home. During the 2 or 3 days of searching for his son, Simon had been thinking that the stream he saw should lead back to the point where they had entered the forest. They agreed to follow the stream back to find their way out. The journey was quite long, taking about 2 days of walking. Along the way, they set up camp and lit fires to cook their meals as usual. On the third day after finding his son, in the afternoon, the sun was very strong. As Simon and his son walked along the stream, they began to recognize the surrounding geography. If they continued a bit further and then turned right, Simon believed they would find the pool he had seen before. He was overjoyed at this realization and hugged his son. But after they walked past the forest edge, Simon felt despair once more, as the view ahead was not what he expected. Instead of the familiar sight, there was a cliff with a waterfall, a place he had never seen before in this forest. Simon felt disheartened by the situation, and his son seemed oblivious to everything, as if he had lost his senses since getting lost in the forest. However, driven by his desire to reunite with his family at home, Simon continued to search for a way out with his son. They slowly descended the waterfall and navigated through rocky areas to avoid the falls. Eventually, Simon found a path, initially thinking it was an animal trail, but upon closer inspection, it seemed more like a human path. He wondered if anyone lived in such a remote part of the forest, which made him hesitate about whether to follow the path. While he was contemplating, his son suddenly walked ahead along the path without saying a word. No matter how much Simon called out to him, his son didn't look back. Simon had no choice but to follow his son. After walking for a while, they came across a hut. The hut wasn't dilapidated. It was made from forest plants and looked quite new. Nearby, there were 3 people, a man and a woman behind the hut, and another man standing to the left of the hut. The man standing by the hut had long hair and a beard like a hermit, but he was dressed like an ordinary villager. Simon's son walked towards the man and gestured for Simon to follow. Simon approached, and the man who resembled a hermit began talking to them. However, they spoke different languages, making communication difficult. From what Simon observed, he sensed the man's friendly intentions. The man spoke to them with a gentle smile, as if to reassure them not to be stressed. The hermit-like man invited them to share a meal together. At that moment, Simon noticed that the man and woman behind the hut were building a fire to roast a large wild boar. The man who looked like a hermit made a welcoming gesture, inviting him and his son to sit and join the meal. As Simon ate the roasted boar, he felt something lingering in his mind. At the same time, he felt relieved to be sitting there, almost entranced by the taste of the food, since up until then, they had only built small fires and scavenged for enough food to survive. While enjoying the roasted boar, a gunshot suddenly echoed through the forest, creating an atmosphere of chaos around Simon. He was jolted back to reality by someone calling out, "Simon! Simon! Get out now!" It was as if he had just awakened from a dream. He recognized the voice as that of a hunter friend who had often come into the forest with him. As Simon regained his senses, he realized that his friend was covering his eyes with his hands. Another friend was shouting, "Keep Simon's eyes covered and get him out of here." Simon didn't understand what was happening. At the same time, he heard his hunter friends talking with the hermit-like man, seemingly negotiating something. As his friends dragged him away, Simon heard 2 more gunshots, and then the hand covering his eyes was removed. What he saw shocked him. The area around the hut where they had been eating the roasted boar now had the lifeless body of the hermit-like man lying on the ground, seemingly shot in the head. But the most horrifying sight for Simon was that the large roasted boar he had seen earlier was now the body of his son, skewered and roasting over the fire. It was a gruesome scene. The piece of meat Simon had eaten was actually his son's arm, which had been roasted and served to him. After realizing this, Simon lost consciousness and blacked out. Later, Simon learned that during the 2 days he was missing, his daughter and wife had been very worried and had asked their hunter friends to help search for him. When the hunters found him, his daughter asked them what had happened. The hunters recounted the events in the forest. After entering the forest, they had followed Simon's trail to the stream and walked along it for a long time. They found a waterfall with traces of blood in the area. They decided to follow the blood trail, which led them along what appeared to be an animal path until they found the hut Simon had seen earlier. As soon as the hunters approached the hut, they smelled a foul odor. They sneaked around to the back of the hut and found 2 human skeletons. When they moved to the front, they saw Simon and the hermit-like man eating Simon's son's corpse. The hunters were shocked by what they saw. One of the hunters could communicate with the hermit-like man and asked him what was happening and why they were eating a human body. The hermit-like man told the hunters that he had seen Simon come to his hut and invited him to eat, but the food was human flesh. The reason he lived in the forest was because of problems in his country, which forced him to flee and live in the forest, eating whatever he could find. The 2 skeletons behind the hut were from villagers who had died while foraging in the forest. Seeing their bodies had not yet decomposed, he took them back as food, just like Simon's son. When Simon wandered into his hut, they talked, and the hermit-like man understood that Simon was willing to eat human flesh, so he invited him to join the meal. The hunter described the hermit-like man as talking like someone who was mentally unstable. The events that led to Simon's rescue involved a struggle, culminating in the hunters deciding to shoot. After this incident, Simon lost his sanity and continuously called out for his son. Over the next 20 years, his daughter took him to doctors for treatment until he improved. After recovering, Simon recounted his experience to his daughter. He lived for a few more years after that and then passed away peacefully.